Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 295, Reading the Bible Differently. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we are diving into the Bible again, this time through the lens of another podcast. A few months ago, we discovered this new podcast. It's called A Podcast of Biblical Proportions. And the two hosts of the podcast, our guests today, are Israelis who are not religious, who didn't come into the podcast with an especially long CV of biblical scholarship credentials. They're the kind of people that we like to call, quote, regular Jews on this podcast. And we're always really excited about serious projects that regular Jews create that explore Judaism or elements of Judaism, or in this case, some of the sources of Judaism in profoundly important ways that maybe other people just would never do. And so they're reading the Bible through this lens of curious, Hebrew-speaking writers, and they're discovering a lot of things that I don't think a lot of people have discovered before. Or to the extent that people have noticed some of these things before, they tend to be locked in the world of academia in ways that are very hard for regular people to ever access. In their own words, A Podcast of Biblical Proportions dives into the Hebrew Bible and explores the ancient Near East. We go over the stories of the Old Testament in the original ancient Hebrew and break it down literally, cinematically, historically, linguistically, and psychologically to better understand the lives of the people who lived in the ancient world. I should note that even though our guests are Israeli, the podcast is in English. I should also note that the podcast is up to getting close to episode 30, and they are still on the story of Jacob. And if you know where that is, it's not even the end of the book of Genesis yet. And so don't worry that you're getting into this podcast late in the game. First of all, you can start from the beginning and binge it and catch up really quickly. That's what I did, and I had an amazing time doing it. And you're going to have plenty of Bible left, years and years of Bible left at the rate they're going. And I promise you, you're not going to think that the rate that they're going is too slow. Every episode is so much fun to listen to and so interesting. So let me introduce our guest today, and then we'll get into the conversation. Our guest today, the creators of A Podcast of Biblical Proportions and the hosts of it, are Omri Harel and Gil Kidron. They are both professional writers and podcasters. They've done other podcasts. And they are the co-founders of a YouTube channel devoted to Game of Thrones and history called GOT Academy. Omri Harel has a degree in cinema studies. He is a professional video editor, and he has worked professionally in the television industry. Gil Kidron has been a journalist and a media critic, as well as a novelist, and his debut novel came out in 2013. It's not translated into English, so I'm going to translate the title on the fly, but I think it would be translated as The Seed of Calamity. We are so excited to jump into this conversation. So Omri Harel, Gil Kidron, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Hey, guys.
Great to be here.
Love your podcast.
Well, the feeling is mutual. I wanted to start by asking you how your podcast came about. And in particular, what is it that you feel is like the specific take that you have on the Bible that you're bringing that, you know, that justifies having a podcast that I know you hope is going to be going on for years and covering the entire Bible? What is your take?
First of all, the podcast came about because we had a show about Game of Thrones like 4 years ago, a YouTube show. Gil and my brother and I produced and directed and edited it. And we did some kind of a spin-off to that show, analyzing the Bible's first stories, but the take was more like informative and scholarly like. So when Gil, we talked about doing a podcast about the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, I thought the take should be something a little bit, with a little bit more meat to it.
Myth or meat?
Meat. We say in Israel, for you I will say, beyond meat.
Thank you.
A little bit beyond meat in it. Because people, I think the corner of explaining the archaeology and what scholars believe and like comparative literature, linguistics, it's things that already exist there. And our take is from like the writer's perspective, because we are from a little bit from the writing world. I studied film, Gil wrote a book, treating it as a text that was created by men, and combining that with what we know from scholars, archaeology, linguistics, and stuff like that, to get into their heads.
Before the Bible is anything, it's a text with stories. And when you read a book or you watch a movie, you can extrapolate from that what the themes are, what was unconsciously in there, when was it made, is it from this perspective or that perspective? But at the core, it's stories. And when you understand the characters and you look at the plot, you can extrapolate from that about the people who wrote the Bible, who lived here 2,500, 3,000 years ago. We have a direct connection into their brain, and we saw a lane that was kind of open, looking at it as the Hebrew epic, and doing what people are doing, let's say, with Beowulf. They're reading Beowulf, and from that they're extrapolating about the time, about the language, how it changed, the ideals, the themes. So here, this is something that is, first of all, 3,000 years ago. It's a very, very different world, and it happens to be the most popular book ever written. So it's like we can read the text and without any specific bias or agenda, other than just discovering the characters, what do they emphasize, what do they de-emphasize, why are they telling us this or that.
It's kind of like analyzing a Hollywood film from the 30s, because I studied films, and I think that an epic, a national epic, a religious epic, it's a little bit more similar to filmmaking, because it's a project that's supposed to have like a lot of cooperation in it. It's not like a one man, one woman sitting in their desk with the light on and writing, thinking, writing. It's not like that. It's more like you have like a hierarchy. You have the narrative that the people on top who are funding the film / epic or whatever, this factory, basically. It's kind of a factory. You had to hire scribes, and you had to have experts in, I don't know, history, myth. So if you take a Hollywood film like, say, Gone with the Wind, our approach is like looking at Gone in the Wind and analyzing the story, the characters, the narrative, and see what can we understand about the period and the people who wrote that story, and why did they write the story and produced it and filmed it. The difference here is like the Bible is like Gone with the Wind, just that the first scene is directed and written by some guy from 2,000 years ago. The second scene is written and directed by a guy 1,000 years ago. With a different camera. In one scene you have camels, and the other scene you have cars. Sometimes the 10th scene is like a rehashing of the second scene, only with a different angle. It's a mess.
And that's where I think like there's at least what I picked up on from your podcast is that the analogy may be more to a TV series than to a film, because one of the things that you picked up on in a relatively recent episode that really struck a chord with me was in looking at the Isaac story, that you specifically talked about how, as writers, you're noticing that the writing is not that good in this story. That we just finished this really great part of Genesis with all these great stories, and Abraham, which is this really like well-drawn character with a whole set of epic adventures that he has. And then we know later comes the Jacob story, and that's really well written and complex, and it's a complex character and all that. And this Isaac in the middle is kind of, not that interesting. The same things happened to him that happened to Abraham. And I loved how you kind of thought about, well, what would this look like in a TV show where they had a really great first season and then they fired the writing staff and they hired new writers because the suits demanded that they write the exact same story with a new character. And like that really helped me understand this process like that you were just describing, that how did the Bible come about? There were suits, there were funders,
exactly.
the people in the temple or whoever who were hiring these scribes to write these stories, and they had an agenda. The scribes might have had a different agenda. And what we see is the result of all of that getting mushed together. I guess what I'm thinking about is how some of these things that we're talking about now have been, discovered by academic Bible scholars in recent years because of archaeology and things like that. But it strikes me that when I listen to your podcast, you're discovering some of the same things simply by reading and paying attention to, in a close way, to the writing itself, which is very hard to do in translation because a translation will almost, unless it's an amazing translation, it will flatten the writing because it's just trying to give the sense of it in another language, whereas you're seeing real differences in the writing from one page to the next because you speak Hebrew and because you're writers.
When we read Abraham, it's interesting that he's a Mesopotamian. Already you have some kind of a distant memory that the inception of mankind came from this place. But he is Levantine. He's not a city dweller. Mesopotamians were very city dweller. That's a religion of a city. Yeah, that's the thing. And just looking at it like the binding of Isaac, and you see the very condensed sentences. It's almost like we talked about it like a short artistic film, as opposed to like the big epics of the Mesopotamians who were like big budget films. And then just looking at its character, scholars or archaeologists, they don't touch that subject. Just look at Abraham as a character. Silent, obedient. He's sad only one time when he needs to expel Ishmael. And if you contrast it to Jacob, Jacob has like a psychology. He dreams. He has battles with the angels or some random guy.
He lies, he cheats.
Exactly. So just looking at it as a literally, as a literary creation.
I listened to that piece where you talked about the writing of the Isaac character, and I think I disagree. I don't know how fully I disagree, but I think what I would agree with is that Isaac as a character is given less color and depth than Abraham and Jacob. I see that as a feature, not a bug. Mm-hmm. I see that as actually the point. And the analogy I do, since we're talking about film, is like, if you watch a TV show and you think that a particular character is part of the main cast and they don't get much airtime, then you would say about that character, they were poorly fleshed out. Like you didn't get to know that character well enough. They're one-dimensional. If you look at that same character and you say, oh, they're a guest star, or they're like a foil, they're a background character, and they actually don't really matter that much, you don't expect them to get the same kind of airtime as the main cast. Like, they're not up for Best Supporting Actor Emmys or Best Actor. They're like background characters. I think Isaac is absolutely not a core character of the book of Genesis. Yeah. I really don't. I think the core character of that generation is Rebecca. Rebecca, if we were doing the comparison there, actually gets a lot more time. And we actually get more of a sense. We get, her relationship with Jacob. She prefers Jacob to Esau. She sort of engineers this trickery that Jacob does with Esau. Like, Rebecca is given a lot. And I actually think that's the point. Like, I think we take this patriarchal lens that has been given to us where we sort of expect all the men's characters to be the core. And then when one of them isn't, when Isaac is this joke. I mean, his name means laughter, by the way. I think it's literally supposed to be that you see this guy and his main moments in the text are almost being killed. And not that that's funny, but like almost being killed and then being blind and not able to tell his sons apart from each other. Like, to me, he's somebody that, like, when he comes on screen, you sort of laugh, like Kramer on Seinfeld. Although Kramer is kind of a core character, so maybe I'm contradicting myself. But like, I guess I'd ask of y'all, I'm not here to say that the whole Bible is written well. I do think there are parts that are written poorly. I think there's parts that are repeated, and certain versions are written better than other versions. There's an argument that some of this is poor writing if we're looking for depth of every character. And there's an argument that if the goal is just sort of to tell the ongoing narrative of this group of people, of this family, that, a character like Isaac serves that goal in being more marginal. So I guess that's more a thought than a question. But what I am curious to hear from you is, when you talk about things being, less effective writing, what makes it more effective and less effective? Like, what makes it good or bad from that approach you're taking of sort of Bible as literature, Bible as theater?
Maybe knowing what we know about the combination of those two people from the north and the south. Jacob is the father of one, and Abraham is the father of the other, and knowing that Abraham has to almost sacrifice his son, and Jacob has to cheat his father. It would be a problem if Jacob was the son of Abraham and he cheated his father, the character that we know. So maybe this is why Isaac is a marginal character, that we don't empathize with him. So you'll be able to have the point of view of Jacob as you're reading the story, because I reread it several times now, and it gives you like a really uneasy feeling about the gravity of what he's doing. Like, he's lying over and over and over and over and over again to his father. They emphasize it. Come closer, let me smell you, let me touch you. Are you sure? Are you sure? So this begs the question also, why would they have a second patriarch that is not important? Why would they have a third patriarch that is he's not a good guy? He's just like, his brother comes to him hungry, give me some food, and the first thing that comes to his mind is, okay, sell me your inheritance. Whoa. Come on. This is harsh.
I want to kind of answer what you said, because the goal of the podcast is not like to have like a literary critique about the effects of the writing, if the writing is good or bad. It is done mainly tongue-in-cheek style. I don't think the writing was supposed to be good. I don't think it's the people who wrote those stories or listened to the stories and then remembered or memorized, and generation later put it on writing, on scrolls. I don't think they intended that. Their intention was the same as somebody like Dostoevsky or like a scriptwriter. The stories were there before people actually wrote them. So the character of Isaac, I don't think it's like we said. It's the suits came and then they screwed up the essence of the naivete of the first season, because they listened too much to what worked and didn't work, and But I don't think Isaac was supposed to be good. I think it's like, if you analyze it literally, sorry about my English, and you see that the writing isn't that good, what does that mean? Why didn't they just, maybe because they invented Isaac, and the people who invented Isaac were the suits and not that talented and creative as the people who came generation before them who could tell a story.
Yeah, and if I could just throw in a Game of Thrones reference here, I mean, it's where the writers of the TV show Game of Thrones, once they ran out of the original material from the writer of the book, the quality of the writing started to go down. So if Isaac is a made-up character in order to try to stitch together Abraham and Jacob, and is written without that, like you said, those old stories, that source material, then the writing is going to be of a different nature and of a different quality. And that was one of the connections that I made from listening to your podcast, because I just want to mention a callback to a previous episode. We had an episode with Tzemach Yoreh, who is a Bible scholar who wrote a book about that, in part, that there's, in the original story, Abraham actually really did sacrifice Isaac. And so the question is, well, what if there was a story in the South of their founder, Abraham, who actually sacrificed his son as a pledge of fealty to God, and then my theory is that in the original story, this is just a theory, he was rewarded with a new son whose name was Judah, and that's where the history of the South comes from. And in the North, we had a different story about a trickster, Jacob or Israel, who did all kinds of things. And at a certain point, they had to stitch together these two stories. So they said, okay, let's revive Isaac, let's make him the father of Jacob, and let's move Judah to be the son of Jacob, something like that. And then you kind of see where some of the writing, okay, but now we got to call in some script doctors to kind of rewrite this story so that it works. And it's not, and you can see the seam. And that's what I'm saying. Like, you guys are seeing the seam in a way that I think until now, the only people who saw those seams were these, like German Bible scholars who figured it out based on certain other criteria, whereas now that we have people who are both speaking Hebrew natively and are secular, so that they're not actually stuck in the traditional understanding of how we must read these stories, only then can we really see it in a way that it's been there all along, which is kind of by the quality of the writing. That was what really struck me.
When you read closely the text and you see that Isaac is like a made-up guy, and you compare Isaac to Ishmael, who is also a very loved son of that great person, Abraham, who is father of us all. But he's not the chosen son, and his lineage is not touched by Yahweh, the God that you must abandon all other gods and worship only him. And that connection is because of Sarah. Because Sarah is Isaac's mother, that connection makes the whole lineage and the whole people, because the Bible acknowledges that Abraham is the father of many people, children who became great with the bow and whatever. So it's interesting what you say, that we automatically think that Isaac is this. Now that we are talking about the period between Abraham and Jacob's, the stories we talk about as like the Isaac episodes, but you say it's actually the Rivka episodes. I think it's interesting, yeah.
I think she's there mainly to take some of the blame for Jacob's crimes.
So I'd love to talk a little bit about language with the two of y'all, because the way that you go about your podcast is really cool on this front. So I'm thinking of one particular example of something that you said about the creation story, where you're talking about, and God created the heavens and the earth. That's how it tends to be translated. This first sentence of, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And you talked about how if you're reading this as a Hebrew speaker, the word that is translated heavens, shamayim, you would likely read as sky.
Yeah.
And the word that you would translate as earth, or that is usually translated as earth, you would read as the land.
The land.
Not the earth, the land. Not like the planet earth, like the land. Land surface that you're standing on is the way you talked about it on the show. And I think that that's so important on so many levels, what you're breaking down there, because so often what people say about Bible is you just can't understand it if you don't know the Hebrew. And like Jewish educators will go to their conferences and take from this the importance of learning Hebrew. And like, look, I love Hebrew. I do. But the issue there is not only that you have to know Hebrew, it's that people made a choice to translate Shamayim as heavens.
Heaven. Yeah, exactly.
Heavens, and not sky. And they made a choice to translate Haaretz not as land, which is kind of, I don't know, it's like lower key, right? It's less formal.
Yeah.
As opposed to earth. And I think that micro issue with the first sentence of the Bible is a much, 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 much bigger issue with Bible generally. We cannot underestimate how fully we have misunderstood this document because we have forced it to fit this very formal, very highfalutin genre of literature. Thous and these and thou shalt. It says you will. It's the same word in Hebrew, thou shalt not X, as you will not X. It's the same thing. It's a choice in English to go with one of those and the other. And neither is wrong, but when you treat something as, it's formal, like it's almost not allowed to have fragments or typos. Spoiler alert to anybody out there, the Bible has typos.
Yeah, many
The Bible
typos.
has fragments.
Yeah.
There's a famous moment that is usually translated away in the Cain and Abel story, where it literally says, and Cain said. beginning quotation mark, nothing. And it doesn't say what Cain said.
That was so weird.
It just goes on to the next thing. It's usually translated, and Cain spoke to Abel, or and Cain spoke. And then they go, and that makes it sound like it was a normal sentence. It's kind of weird that you would say somebody spoke and not say what they said, but it doesn't make it occur to you that this is just missing text. And I'm bringing that up not because I want to think, oh, the Bible, the worst, like they leave out, like it's because this is sort of sketchings down from different eras and different times, and stories are yes, they're thoughtfully prepared and put together, and I don't want to discount all of that. But there's a way in which when we think that this is such a formal thing, we're going to misunderstand it. When we think that this is all this perfect text ordained by God, there are things that you're not going to allow yourself to see. You're not going to allow yourself to see a typo. And there's ways in which rabbis like correct the text that have been accepted over hundreds of years. And like you're supposed to chant differently because they are unwilling to let the text have flaws. And so my question that I'd relay back to you is, when you look to it in your way, and it is allowed to have those flaws, I think people see that as like, oh, you must be sort of less of a believer. You're not sort of approaching the Bible with reverence. But from my perspective, that's still a form of reverence. It's just we're allowed to revere things that had mistakes.
I think that first of all, we try to avoid concentrating on all that has been said about these stories for the past 2,000 years. That I can see it myself, block me from actually reading the story as it is. And I like how you said that it's a form of reverence, because it's okay. These are people that actually existed, lived in a time so long away. Why not? It's a miracle that we have this book and that it has become so popular. Why not read it as it is? And the power of not allowing yourself to read what is actually written is amazing. Like people who have read the Bible dozens of times, you can ask them, what do you think about the flaming spinning sword at the end of the Garden of Eden story? And they're like, what? What do you think about the second creation story? What? What do you think about the two deities in the Noah story saying exactly the same thing, but just like differently, because the first one is more rational and distant and the second one is more angry and just like try stuff and see how it goes. So they are also different characters. And if we appreciate what they wrote, then it's just so much better.
I don't get that thing that if the text itself is imperfect, that means that it wasn't written by God, that it somehow, I don't know, challenges your belief. I think if you're a believer, there's nothing that analyzing text can really, really shatter your belief. It's like somebody asked the Rabbi Milobavitch, if the evolution is true and the Earth is 4 billion years old, how come you believe that the Earth was created 6,000 years ago? Then he said, God created the world old.
So I have a question that you're still in the book of Genesis. So, but my understanding is that the game plan is to keep on rolling right through Exodus and Leviticus and the Torah and all the way into the rest of the Bible afterwards. I'm curious to back out for a second and ask, like, you've gone about your podcast in a certain set of ways for Genesis that I think some of those ways could apply to the entire Bible. But I think Genesis is also a very unique book in the Bible. And sometimes folks don't always know that because, like, we all learn about the Genesis stories in Sunday school, or at least a lot of us learn about Genesis stories in Sunday school. And then maybe some of the big ones in Exodus, we know about, like the Passover story. And then afterwards, it's like we have a lot of people know very little, at least in an American context. In Israel, you know, some more of these stories often seep into collective consciousness. But I guess my question is, like, what do you think you might have to change when you get to points in the Bible that are not narrative stories? I mean, once you're even in Exodus, like there is narrative story, but it's different. It's sort of terser, and the narrative story is placed in the midst of like building the tabernacle and all that stuff. And once you're in Leviticus, forget it. Like you're mostly not in narrative stories. You're in legal rulings. There are some little narrative stories here and there, but so like, what will be different when you're in later parts of the Torah, and I understand in asking that you haven't gotten there yet, so you don't fully know, but like I'm asking this mostly to understand something about Genesis, like what makes Genesis Genesis, and what makes other parts of the Torah different and other parts of the Bible different.
I think it's a very important question that we actually discovered as we were going through the chapters, and we realized that the genre is epic stories, like the Greeks, like the Mesopotamians, like every civilization that tried to explain to itself how it came to be according to what is important to it. Like if you live in the mountains, then you will have gods that are relevant to the mountains, and you will have social problems that are relevant because your neighbors are very far away. Their specific epic story is about hospitality in the desert. Okay, so this is a specific world that is to them, and their magical garden, and like their most magical place at the beginning is a garden. If you are living in a jungle, then you have a different epic story. So we look at it as basically the epic story genre, and how they explain to themselves their own ancient history. And if you look at it through that genre, then it's very informing that those are, again, like a people that don't have a lot of power, a lot of influence. Their main guys are not kings or warriors. They don't have even, like if you compare Noah to Utnapishtim, the same flood story, the Mesopotamian flood story. So he's like super wise, like Buddhist-like, and he tests Gilgamesh and sends him on all kinds of errands. And Noah doesn't even have one line. Doesn't even speak the whole time. Doesn't even think. So okay, let's talk about that. Let's explore that.
I think the prequel example you said,
but it's like found footage.
It's found footage that was edited as a prequel. Yeah,
it's interesting because I wasn't thinking this way, and I know Lex has sort of complex views about the Star Wars series as well. But like as I'm listening to this, I'm kind of thinking like, what if we were doing a podcast on the Star Wars movies and we started with episode 1, The Phantom Menace? You know, and I would say, no, that's not the right place to start. The right place to start is episode 4, the movie that we know as Star Wars, or A New Hope. And I could see it either way. I mean, in a certain way, you would start with The Phantom Menace if you're trying to look at the whole story as it kind of ended up in George Lucas's mind, I guess. But if you're looking at kind of the history of how did this story come about, and you want to see what was really the earliest material, then I think you would look at A New Hope. And so I'm sort of thinking about that in terms of this, because, you know, I'm also thinking about like what's a modern analogy like to what's going on. Like I think about it. I mean, obviously for obvious reasons about what's been going on in recent weeks and months. I'm thinking about Afghanistan, and you know, I kind of think about Afghanistan as a place where the great powers of the world, for various reasons, are always trying to occupy them and take them over and change things or whatever. And that feels a little bit like we can imagine the ancient land of Israel, where these great powers, Egypt and the Mesopotamian powers, were just always kind of going through there and doing stuff for totally different reasons. And that's, like you say, like this little insignificant people has to try to find meaning in their lives. And so they kind of come up with this story how really in kind of a secret way, they were at the center of everything. And I wonder, like, is the best way to then look at that story is to look at the prequel that they ended up writing long after all this in order to kind of try to set everything up? Or would be the best way to kind of start with, okay, let's look at that time in history where maybe this is probably happening, which is probably around the time that we know as the destruction of the first temple, that basic time period, and the Babylonian exile, because that's where really everything happened.
First of all, about Star Wars, it's interesting because I thought similar things about Star Wars as an analogy of how a religion is created, because something that Star Wars specifically has is a lot of fan fiction. If I'm not mistaken, it's one of the first ever fan fiction industry, because the time between movies was so long, then people needed to tell more stories and, how we say here, like dig more and dig more. And because of all the fan fiction, later you need some kind of an authority to decide what's canon and what's not. But the function of Genesis as a prequel, as like some kind of understanding ancient people, first of all, I believe a lot of the stories, even though they were canonized and, put in place and edited, redacted, whatever, they existed. So you can still have some kind of a glimpse into the minds of people who lived 3,000 years ago or 2,800 years ago. The stories themselves weren't invented out of nowhere.
No, for sure they weren't. For sure they weren't.
The fact that the stories are so tiny and short, it's not even that difficult to memorize them. And, you don't even need to memorize it by heart, word by word. It's enough that you remember that there was a guy that his name is Abraham, which is pretty easy. It's big father or tall father or high father. It's an easy name to remember. And it's kind of makes sense that he's the father of our people, So I think that those stories existed, and you can still look into their minds, even though that it's true that it's more like a prequel Genesis. It's like, okay, we're here, let's explain how we got here.
I don't think anybody in this conversation would disagree. I think we should view Star Wars both ways. I think it would be a different experience as a viewer to watch through chronologically, where chronologically means the order that they were created by humans, by George Lucas and other humans, versus chronologically in the story of the galaxy long, long ago, far, far away, which is to say 4 through 6, then 1 through 3, then 7 through 9, versus 1 through 9. And I would endorse wildly people doing both of those and then reflecting on what's different, because it would help you understand Star Wars generally. It would help you understand the orientation of the people who created the Star Wars trilogies in the different generations that they did so. And that is all really relevant to what we're talking about. And so I'm curious to ask the two of you, have you read the Book of Jubilees?
Sefer Yovalim? No, I haven't read it.
Okay,
no.
So I can't assign you any homework, and it's not I don't have any right to do that. I do think you would enjoy it, because what it does on this front is fascinating. Because imagine the Star Wars movies were in an order that's actually a hybrid of the two I just described. Imagine the Star Wars movies began with a snippet of Luke Skywalker in Episode 4, and then it went back to Episode 1 and went from there. Because Jubilees, you start on Mount Sinai. This is a book that retells the book of Genesis, and it happens on Mount Sinai to start, which makes no sense, right? Because Mount Sinai isn't even in the book of Genesis. But you start on Mount Sinai, and you're like with God and this angel figure in Moses. And then immediately it says previously on the Israelite people. I mean, it doesn't say that, but it flashes back to the creation story.
Yeah, the text that they have, the rolling text, the scrolling text that they have at the beginning of the movie is Star Wars.
Yes, exactly. So it does that, and what you then realize. And by the way, my own approach to the Book of Genesis in its original form has been drastically altered by reading Jubilees, which does this, because I've realized, this book was written much later. It was written around 150-ish BCE, so a few hundred years after the original Book of Genesis. But they realized already that kind of the purpose of Genesis is to get you to this group of people in Exodus that has this Sinai moment. And then they told the story through that image. And so I'm not here to say everybody should ditch Genesis and read Jubilees. I'm here to say that act of creating an alternate order, of creating a different approach to reading this text is a rich contribution. And so if all of us were to approach this text and say not, what's the right way to read this? Should I be reading this from X perspective or from Y perspective? But rather, I'm going to read the story of Jacob and Esau from the perspective that Jacob's a liar and an asshole, like you described, which I agree with, by the way. And then I'm going to read the perspective charitably, I'm going to try to be in Jacob's mind and approach it with his interests. What changes there? Or what changes if I read this from Rachel's perspective? Or what changes if I read this from Zilpa's perspective, a servant? What changes if, like, to me, the takeaway isn't like, okay, there's a bunch of potential readings and we got to figure out which one is works best for our time. It's actually, let's be greedy and read in every possible way, because our own experience, our own meaning-making muscles will be flexed in ways that serve our society now and serve people in the future. And also, this is sort of an addendum, but like how it might be uniquely the role of people like you and like us who are not scholars, we're not official, right? But it might be specifically the role of people who are not like PhDs in biblical history to do some of this work, because they're subject to sort of more rules than we are.
First of all, like, I listen to podcasts about history and stuff by scholars, but not always. Some of the most successful history podcasts, like the History of Rome and Tides of History, are by people who are not associated and married to a certain school of thought. For example, I was listening to a conversation with an archaeologist about the Indo-European people. And he was asking her, where do you think that they originated? And she was like immediately, my mentor, my sponsor, whatever the term is, he's the one who came up with a hypothesis. So I'm with him. And also in biblical scholarship, you have like schools of thoughts, and even the different professions, they don't communicate well between themselves. That is what they are saying. Linguistics, archaeology, they have like a giant gulf between them, and other kinds of history researchers. Our only agenda is, how do we find the most interesting things in this incredible ancient story that allows us to get a glimpse into the minds of ancient people? And we are willing to use all the tools at our disposal and come up with theories without fearing that we'll cross someone, or maybe that we're even wrong. We're just trying to figure out, like, when I'm listening back to our first episodes, I'm like, I'm not sure I was right here. I'm not, yeah. But this is just like an exploration. It's a journey.
It's important, if you go back to Star Wars, if you want to understand Star Wars, then you should watch it 4 to 6, then the prequels, and also chronologically. If you want to understand it completely, try everything. But specifically, if you want to understand, I don't know, George Lucas, then you should, I will recommend to, I think the first Star Wars is like a more, let's say, pure. Like, he didn't know that it was going to be that successful. He probably imagined that people would like it, otherwise he wouldn't, do the film. The story is like a little bit more, if you want to understand the mindset of the writer, look at the 4th episode. If you want to understand the mindset of Hollywood, look at the prequels. Then you will see it's even documented, specifically about George Lucas, highly stressed. He had 10 drafts. It's like it was a mess. It was a mess. The pressures that he dealt with as a creator and also as a businessman, basically, because he owned the tag, whatever, the brand and everything. So if you want to understand Star Wars world universe, then try everything. Even read the fan fiction, because then you will have a glimpse about the effects of that religion. If we say Star Wars is a religion, how it triggers people emotionally and inspire them to pick up on little hints that are in the story that are not well developed. Suddenly, I don't know, Boba Fett is like an icon. It appeared like 2 seconds, but no, we need to understand that Boba Fett, because all I have is the VHSs, and I regurgitated them, and I destroyed my VCR, watching them. So take everything.
I think like another ingredient that we kind of found out that we bring to the table and that other people have not tried this ingredient is again the writer's perspective. You have archaeologists on the job, you have linguists on the job, you have biblical scholars. But reading Abraham's character and understanding him and his motivations and how he compares to other and what that means, I think we are trained for this. And this is something that is missing. And from listening to researchers who research the ancient world, they are saying that there are two things that are now regarded as the most important new tools to understand the ancient world. One is DNA, and the other one, I think they call it comparative mythology. And they're talking about all the myths out there and all the stories out there in the Americas, in Africa, everywhere. Nobody's doing it with the Bible. And if you're a biblical scholar, I don't know how comfortable you would be doing a literary analysis of the plot and the characters, and I'm not sure that's your wheelhouse. We're kind of in a position to be able to absorb all the knowledge out there and give our take through the magic ingredient of the writing. Preparing for this conversation, Dan told us that it was kind of a chutzpah in a good way. And when we were talking together, Omri said, if an archaeologist will start and break down Abraham's character, that would be not a chutzpah, but a chutzpah. Like the Israeli version, which is negative. We will be like offended. How dare you step into our
Get off
field?
our turf.
Yeah, get off our turf. Now I can identify with the academics.
We're going to close out, but to our listeners now, like, I framed the question in a funny way that I partially regret already, which is I said that you and we are not experts. And I stand by that. We're not experts in the way that most people define experts in Bible, like scholars with PhDs, whatever. But we are, all four of us in this conversation and everybody listening, experts in something, in our own experience at the very least, but even if not, experts in whatever field we're working in. And we should be taking the skills we have, the knowledge we have, the lenses we have, and applying them to this text and to, Judaism more broadly beyond just the texts. So I thank you for gifting us with that reminder and gifting me with that reminder. And I thank you both so much for joining us for this amazing conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
It's a pleasure.
And thank you so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We want to close out this episode in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. And there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook or Twitter or Instagram handles. All of those are Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our website, judaismunbound.com. And third, you can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you're able to make to us, and you can do that on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift via judaismunbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.